So welcome to Casting Light, everyone. I'm Jayla Mamadova, and we have with us today Vanessa Keverenge. Vanessa is a lead organizer at Organize Florida, who brings her love of people, strategy, and power analysis to local and state politics. Vanessa's parents immigrated to Central Florida from very different countries and organized a diverse community and family in their new country. This upbringing cultivated Vanessa's passion for building broad-based coalitions and challenging conventional norms of what communities should look like. She's proud to have organized in campaigns like restoring ex-felons' rights to vote in Florida and a campaign for affordable housing, winning $370 million in funding for housing in Florida. Vanessa, as I told you also offline, your background is amazing and reading it just inspires me. And we're going to get into all of the key issues that you've been working on. But before doing so, I want to hear a little bit more about your background, what got you to political organization, what brought you to Organize Florida.
Yeah, thanks, Jalen, and thanks for having me. I guess I'll say I kind of feel like it's in the family. My parents very much had to organize themselves just to get paid fairly in a rural town in Central Florida and Wales. And so I kind of just grew up with the notion that if there's something that you can do to address a problem, then you should do it and bring other people with you. So I guess I was that student government geek all throughout school and in college. And I think college is the moment where it was really agitational for me because we had this intersection of international students and students of color who were talking about just disparities in their experiences. That didn't align with the things that I guess the college experience that so many people often talk about or that's supposed to be upheld. And so I think that was the moment that really I think it was a catalyst for me, just in terms of what I wanted to do beyond college. And that's kind of how I got into it.
That's amazing. And Vanessa, when we think about the challenges that we're going to get into, COVID-19 associated grievances, as well as Black Lives Matter, but just in light of the issues and the chaos that's ongoing in 2020, what does that make political organization for you when you're thinking about it in 2021, as well as for our audience that's maybe thinking about starting a career in this field, but with everything that's ongoing, they wouldn't necessarily know where to start? Where would be a good place to start, and how should they be looking at for organizations, as well as what challenges should they be thinking about as they're preparing themselves to enter this field?
I think right now is a great time also because it's an election year. It's weird. The market has still, it hasn't shrunk in the sense that it's an election year. So there are folks, they're hiring. That's a good way to start a career in political organizing because people are hiring for their campaigns. I think a good place to start would be looking at labor unions and their affiliates, because a lot of them often work with community organizations. So they hire researchers, they hire organizers, they hire data people and statisticians, research firms also too, they're and funders, the people that fund grassroots movement. And organize people's money to make that happen. Those are also ways in which people can look to get involved. And then also just community organizations like Organize Florida, the Dream Defenders, and I would start Googling and seeing which ones are connected in the coalition groups. And that's a great place to start.
Vanessa, let's talk about Organize Florida. And we've been seeing Organize Florida pop up everywhere, and I've looked over your interviews. If you could just maybe start off by talking about the work and how it's progressed specific to COVID-19 associated grievances when it comes to processing unemployment claims or unemployment insurance. What have been the solutions that the organization has been advocating, and how would you, prioritize them, or how would you stack them up in terms of order of priority and how we should be thinking about those?
Well, so some organizations try to focus on a broad base of things, but as you know, you can't really specialize effectively in everything. You do kind of need to hone in and specialize. So Organize Florida is, I would say it gets its edge by being the largest running the largest voter registration program in the state. And then on the other side, the Florida Education Fund side, it's training members and doing education, political education, agitation, how do you build power? How do you build power in communities? How do you build power in communities for people who are low income, people who don't often have a seat at the table? And then also, I think it's like in candidate endorsement. So it's getting out the vote, because that's how you exercise your power. Because, you know, candidates will have to like listen to your organization locally when you have the power to elect one person over the other. And then with COVID, it's pivoted so much. There's just been so much work in the sense that we launched surveys to address, to see like where the disparities were in unemployment. And it's been a nightmare with unemployment. And we work with our partners, like Jobs with Justice, on that, and then some partners in Tallahassee who had press conferences to push the governor. And now there's going to be an investigation, a federal investigation into what the governor hasn't handled the unemployment website and unemployment insurance. And it's just been chaotic. But at the same time, people have been really galvanized to get involved, and people are organizing, people are talking about it, people are ready to go, and people are ready to vote. So in some ways it's good, because it's good to see so much chaotic energy and new people just getting involved. As an organizer, I don't even have to really like convince people or like polarize them at all. It's just like people saying, okay, great, like what can I do to help? What can I do to step in?
Vanessa, how have you dealt with, what has been the criticism, and how have you dealt with backlash so far? Or do you think it's just a lot of talk, and they're just, obviously there are more people that are supporting these initiatives, but what has been the government backlash, and how has Organized Florida been tackling it, and how do you anticipate to address those challenges going forward?
So it's kind of funny because Florida is a Republican trifecta. And that's where we have like Republican control of the governor's seat, the Supreme Court, and the legislature. And so I think we're used to Florida not being the best place for workers' rights. So we're always on the defense. So the goal is to just like flip that a little bit. And I think it's interesting because you have to just strategize harder to have some wins. Like we organized like a people's convening to get the Sadowski trust funds. It's a allocated set of funds for affordable housing in the state, and the legislature has rated it for the past like 15 years. And so it's just like trying to think strategically about like what's in Republican legislators' interest as well, but in a way that won't like polarize them, because we do know that like President Trump has a huge effect on what's popular and what's in right now. And that trickles down, and there's this real fear where you have to have like agitational conversations with elected officials, and you have to kind of give them courage, and part of that is showing them that people are behind them. And that's something that I never expected in politics a little bit. Just like how many people go into politics and they want a position and they want that power, but then there's a fear to use it, in a sense, to do something that is like out of the norm, even though it could help. And then with Black Lives Matter, we just had a huge resistance by Democratic Mayor of Orange County, Jerry Demings, who, in response to protests and the climate that we're in this crisis, advocated for adding an additional $15 million to the Sheriff's County budget and 20 new officers, and giving away additional money to Universal Studios, a multi-billion-dollar organization or company. So I think there just needs to be like more intentional organizing around that elected official, because I think that the Orlando city mayor has gotten a lot of pressure and heat, and the county mayor has not.
Vanessa, in the article that you sent over it, and I've seen your criticism of that. When we just think about budgetary considerations going forward, right? What is going to push to have those, have the funds be adequately prioritized in a way that's, as you mentioned, not going to polarize the stakeholders and the parties involved, especially when we think about COVID-19 and the second peak that we're really actually seeing right now in Florida, and how this may further unfold and bring about, its own second wave of issues. How should we be thinking about budgetary considerations and how those are going to unfold, and how is Organized Florida specifically thinking about simply put, preventing, as you mentioned, 5 million in county funds going to Universal Florida when you have all these social programs and efforts where the money would have been made of better use.
Yeah, so I think this is something that's organic, that's come from the protesters and this political climate that we're in, and nationally as well. Excuse me. And people just don't want these bloated budgets for police forces because they haven't been keeping our communities safer. When you look at City of Orlando's budget, it's something like 31.6% of their entire general fund goes towards the police, and 0.2% of that budget is allocated for affordable housing. And there's so much policy about housing, security, like healthcare, access to jobs, resources, education, all those things reduce crime, like decriminalizing crime. Like Portugal is a great example of what that does. For a country's security and that public health problem that drug addiction is. And I just think the repeated denial of both the Democrats and Republicans to address some of those issues and to decriminalize poverty and decriminalize drug addiction and like homelessness, like that unwillingness perpetuates crime, and it creates a situation where you say we need to have the cops in unsafe neighborhoods, but at the same time, it's insane that you have a police force that's supposed to protect and keep people safe, but they have riot gear and these LRAD machines that they use that can deafen people, and they're macing and tear gassing people. It's just ironic when countries, it's outlawed in the Geneva Convention for countries to use that against another state civilians. So, but we're using that on our own people. It's bizarre, and I get it in the sense it's because these police forces have so much money. It's like they have to use it, and so if you're trained to kill and deploy like military weapons, then that's what you're going to do. So I think it's just looking at a reframing and a reprioritization of everything within the budget to like, let's address the root causes, let's be compassionate, let's actually help people and build a better world, than just after the fact lock people up or injure them.
Vanessa, you mentioned the example of Portugal, and immediately in my mind, as with other issues and just in private conversations, the backlash to that or the immediate reaction would be, well, U.S. is a different landscape. How would you respond to that? What is different when we're thinking about from the standpoint of the opposition or the critic saying that U.S. is different? What is different about the U.S. and what is not different? How should we be thinking about that when specific to decriminalization, implementing essentially the same policies that we saw play out, as you said, abroad?
I mean, I think one thing I'm always cautious about with comparing the U.S. to Europe is that the U.S. is a lot less homogenous, which, what we're seeing now exacerbates tensions and clashes and a fear, and that fear is real and it manifests itself in like crazy ways. People voted for Donald Trump because of out of a fear that they were getting left behind, and a fear of the other people and immigrants. So I definitely take your point, and I think that comparisons only go so far. But I think I would say to the critics that, like, what good are we? What good are we doing? We're just taking people who are likely already in terrible situations. We know that people don't do drugs. I mean, perhaps maybe they started for fun, but people don't continually take like opioid pills, and it's a huge problem. Those usually it's in areas where there's little opportunity and resources, and there's a depression there, and there's an underlying cause. So I'm more interested in why not solving the root cause of this, because it's wild to me that addiction problem in this country just started by, the Sackler family profited off of this and pushed and marketed those pills to people. And now they're addicted and they obtain those pills through their doctor. And like these companies benefited and profited off of those people's pain and suffering. And then now it's okay, where we're going to criminalize that and put them in a system again, which the US has private prisons. One of the biggest groups is in Florida as well. And folks are also profiting off of that. And then taxpayers go towards that. So it's just, to me, it's just insane because it perpetuates this dangerous notion, criminalizing drugs makes it more lucrative for dealers. It makes it more dangerous. Like we've seen this with marijuana, like the decriminalization of marijuana too. Like once you decriminalize it, you make it less lucrative for people to sell and traffic it. So it kind of takes the incentive out of like these people profiting off of other folks' like need or want for a substance. And it just blows my mind that the folks believe that just locking people up, as we've continually done. We've seen the war on drugs, and we've seen the effect that that has had on America, and it hasn't done anything to solve the problem. It's made it worse.
No, I completely agree with you. And on the point of law enforcement, there is a group that is proposing or pushing for the complete abolition of law enforcement, right? And the range of demands when we think about the local movement, it's pretty broad. And then there are others that fall on the spectrum of advocating for accountability measures for misconduct, which that in itself can be a vague term, right? And then the question is, well, what does that mean, right? And it can give way to, I don't want to say necessarily abuse, but just kind of a small nod to appease the protest. So in that spectrum, where do you stand, and where do you think is an effective stance to have? What is actionable when we think about the immediate future?
I'm sorry, what is actionable when we think about?
When we think about the immediate future, so we have the complete abolition of law enforcement, and then we have, on the other spectrum, just a group that's advocating for, just more, they'll say they're just, some accountability to start with certain measures. And the critics of that will say, well, that's a little bit soft. So when we think about soft versus maybe hard stances, what is actionable in between? Because there's so many demands that have come up, and there's so many different groups that are advocating for different demands that range across that spectrum. Where do you stand is my first question. And second, what is really actionable in the immediate future when we think about, in the next year or so?
Well, for part of my stance, to me, it's dependent upon different communities. Different communities have different relationships to the police. Different communities have police accountability, like even within Central Florida. The town that I live in has a lot of the 8 can't wait policies in place. But I think we want to definitely go way beyond that. My stance is I think there needs to be like a complete fundamental like rethinking of police in this country, because we know that from inception, the police were created to maim, capture, and bring back slaves. That's a problem to me, because then, since inception, they are there in place to protect property and to secure and ensure property, which enslaved Black folks in this country were property. So that's a problem to me, because the parallels of that is even today, we see police protecting property at all over human life. And it's a little weird to me, especially because from what I grown up hearing about the police's role. So mine is abolish, in the sense that we need a fundamental restructuring, specifically because in this country, we've tried it. When Clinton signed the crime bill in the 90s, a lot of folks and community leaders and Black leaders got on board because there was a serious problem in different cities with crime, and there was an effort to address that issue. The problem is we just exacerbated mass incarceration and the system of incentives where we have jails and police have to fill those jails. So it's like the goal isn't even to correct someone, even though we call them correctional facilities, it's to detain and hold, and then folks profit off of that. So I just don't understand. That's disastrous for society. Like imagine the trauma of just going into a jail and staying there for decades and then being kicked out and being expected to just thrive and make it, but you have a record. You can't get a job in Florida. You can't get you can't qualify for housing assistance or food assistance. And then we don't have, the box has not been banned in Florida. So employers can ask folks if they have a record, and it's like, how do you get a job? And how do you survive? So it's like crime is kind of your only kind of way in to make money and to pick yourself back up. So we're just creating this cycle and this weird permanent underclass. So that's why, to me, I think that this country needs to radically just redo how we do policing and how we jail and rehabilitate people, because it is not working. And I think that in terms of the reform, in 2015, we tried that. You know, we have body cams nationally. It costs billions of dollars, and we just have a ton of Black folks getting killed on camera. There hasn't been accountability. It's insane. You know, we have full reporting on what happened to Breonna Taylor getting murdered, and there's still like no justice. And so I think one of those things is the police unions. They have an immense amount of power. And in Florida, the FOP, the Fraternal Order of the Police, they are not very happy with our local sheriff and John Mina and our OPD chief, Chief Roland, because they believe that he's been too soft on protesters, I guess, by not just like wiping people out and rounding them up to arrest them. And it's strange, because to me, the police have an immense amount of power. And that power needs to be checked, because absolute power corrupts. Absolutely.
Vanessa, in the start of your answer, you said that, you know, some of this also depends on, when we think about actionable measures, it depends on the local effort and the local dynamic of the people with the police. Is there anywhere in the United States that you would say where it's relatively better, where the relationship is such that it's better than what we're seeing really across nationwide? Is there any particular community or area that you would single out?
None that I have seen. I would love it if somebody could show me an example of it, but I do know like there's a real fear of the police, and it's particularly for Black folks and Native Americans, people of color. Like, I don't know, the police, it's funny because I say Winter Haven, the town where I've grown up, they have a better relationship with the police, but if I see the police around and I know some of the officers, I still like, it's stressful. It's panic. It causes panic for me. So I don't know of anywhere, but I would love to see it in this country.
Do you have insight as to, you mentioned police unions obviously being a big part of this problem. Do you have any insight into how they're structured in a way where we may see maybe dismantling of some of these organizations, or what would be, I guess, the effective power over police unions where we would start seeing a change in the conversation and in the behavior and the ongoing processes within those union groups for the police?
So I know that like police unions play a big role in terms of like qualified immunity, which is something that protects cops, and particularly in Florida. So it's been interesting, I think, even just having this debate amongst like other activists and other protesters and organizations. Florida's laws, like our state legislature, preempts a lot of the things around the police. So we have laws that mandate that county and city charters must have police officers. And then after the Parkland shooting in Florida, there was an expansion of the requirements so that like SROs, like the resource officers had to be in public schools in Florida. So it's also weird too, because folks talk about a review board and accountability boards, which many counties do have, but it doesn't have the ability to fire police. There's no teeth, because it's also preempted at the state level. So I think a lot of it would be like the state legislature and like passing some laws, and the governor have to sign that into law. And then also I think it would be just like fundamentally rethinking this idea of police unions, which is why a lot of cities are disbanding their police force, because when you disband the police force, then the union contract no longer holds.
And so, well, speaking of action that we're already seeing, right? So the Orlando police chief, he said he would prohibit chokeholds and no-knock warrants. How should we be interpreting that? Because that also has received criticism that that's just kind of a nod to appease the protests. Is that in the right direction, or what would you expect to be the next step following that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a step. I mean, it's kind of funny because I just think, okay, cool, you're banning chokeholds, but police will stand on, like they'll kneel on people's spine, which it's just excessively ridiculous. Or you have these videos where civilians are keeping a person who the police are trying to arrest. They're trying to keep them calm and subdued and de-escalate a situation. There have been many protests where I have de-escalated situations between other people and the police, and it's just like, why are we doing that work for them? So I think it's not enough. I think it's something that maybe a step in the right direction that the police chiefs can do, and that's something I think they should have already decided to do. I think like de-escalation tactics as a policing policy are things that police should already embrace and do on their own. And I think it's something that they can do without looking at the budget, I think, before. But I think there's just so much more that they can do. Like Chief Roland needs to fire a lot of officers like Keller and Mills, officers who have reported misconduct, officers who have been excessively violent with folks, officers who have white supremacist tattoos and Nazi insignia. They're officers who have mocked Heather Heyer, a protester in Virginia, a white woman who died because some folks ran a car into her during a protest on purpose to kill her. So it's like, why are, like, looking at your police force and looking at like the character and the way in which those officers have acted within their community, I think those policies are meaningless without that accountability. And there's some police chiefs who would fire officers like that, but I think Chief Roland really needs to rethink that, because there's a long list of officers who have such like misconduct allegations, and it's recorded.
Do you, just out of curiosity, do you have that list, or is an organization like Organized Florida, and there were a few others that are of the local groups, is there like a list that's advocating for the removal of a specific list of police?
Yes, there's a protest group called the Orlando Freedom Fighters, and they have a list. I can send that to you. They have like a county list and the county sheriff, and then the OPD city list.
And is there, we're going to go back into the issues, but just for our audience, and I'm going to link that below as well, in terms of taking action, was there a petition to sign, or if you could maybe forward some material so I could include below that what we could do to take action and to help, you know, even from our screens. I know there are people that are protesting. I have friends who are protesting here in New York, family who was protesting here in New York, but you know, for those that want to start taking steps, if you could share that material with me, and I will link it down below.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vanessa. And another thing I want to, I guess, touch on is the as we're talking about de-escalation, the deputization of civilian representatives in the training in de-escalation techniques. Talk to me about that process. What does that look like? What are the efforts that have started to do this, right? Because the conversation has started to implement this, but what do you see as the process taking hold in terms of actually training civilian representatives and training police to de-escalate?
I think it goes into just training. If I think this is something that police chiefs should have done on their own, and I think we're beyond this right now in terms of training their own police officers. But then again, I think a lot of police officers are just not equipped, to be honest. Like when you have a police officer called in to settle a civil dispute, like an argument between neighbors or family members, I mean, then you're asking the police to be like a crisis counselor or like an ombudsman, and that's usually probably something just that's beyond their skill set. But we do see, and I like this move where we're the need to deploy counselors and social workers instead is taking place. And in St. Pete, recently, this last week, they announced that they would not be automatically sending out police officers for every 911 call. So for like nonviolent situations, they would deploy folks like a social worker or someone else who could, I think in Minnesota, there's some folks called violence interrupters, and they're people who are trained specifically to disarm and de-escalate rather than up the violence.
Vanessa, I also want to talk to you about, it's a little bit of a shift, but about the eviction moratorium. And I know you've done a lot of work on this. So with that being extended out into August 1st, How should we be thinking about it again in the context of the second week and a potentially even worsening in the fall? What are the next steps in terms of what Organized Florida is going to be advocating, and do you anticipate a further extension of that?
So the next steps are to continually keep fighting and asking Governor DeSantis, who is the biggest failure of a governor that I've ever heard of in this country. I've just been astounded by his unwillingness to act and get ahead of certain issues. And we've had to keep pushing and fighting every month for him to extend the eviction moratorium. And the issue to me too with evictions, it's just a very violent process. The sheriff's office gets involved, and so when an eviction is like filed, I learned a lot about the process. Like the clerk of courts has to process it, but our clerk. More Russell, she's done a great job of trying to slow that process down, trying to look into options to see like what she can do to stall, like can people be put on a payment plan. But once it's issued or like filed by the landlord, she does have to process it, and the sheriff can choose not to issue a summons. But I frankly, our sheriff who's up for election, John Mina, doesn't have the courage to do anything like that, and he could be held in contempt of court by the chief judge for not doing it. And our chief judge, Myers, also he extended it one time, but after that, he's just been unresponsive about it. So it's up to the governor to stop it. And it blows my mind, like during the idea that during this pandemic, during the recessions started, that we'd be willing to let thousands of people just be homeless, in addition to Central Florida and Orlando's like housing crisis and homelessness crisis. I don't understand it, especially when we know that certain policies that would help with housing brings new jobs and it brings in revenue and it's good for the state, like financially too. And so that argument doesn't hold any weight with folks. I just don't. It's just really demoralizing and it just makes me really sad.
So is there any hope for assistance, at least in the form of maybe financial assistance, when we think about those that are at risk of eviction? And I've seen Organized Florida members touch on negotiation with banks to ensure mortgage borrowers get that forbearance. Do you see that happening?
Yeah, and some people are doing it, and there's some landlords who are really stepping up and being compassionate and getting ahead of it. I've seen in Orlando, I've seen in New York too, like some landlords like writing op-eds and like posts and letting people know that they will not be evicting them because it's a hard time for people all around. And there are some like smaller banks who are willing to work with people who are attempting to make payments and trying. But I think overall, it's just going to be a struggle, and Organized Florida and other organizations are just going to look into like eviction defense, like literally just like mobilizing people to stop people from getting mass evicted, because what else can you do? And I think one of the powers that people have is the ability to mobilize and use like their body to just show up in spaces and to just challenge people. And that's kind of like just the greatest weapon that the people have. And I think it's just like leveraging that to make a statement and to show politicians and elected officials that certain things are not okay. And I wish there was more like moral leadership. And I definitely want to like inspire people to elected officials to stand up in their power and to lead. But I think there's a fear of backlash. There's a fear of doing something that's different. There's a fear of going against like the tourist lobby in the state, which is why, you know, we have our theme parks that are opening. Like Disney opened when Florida is like breaking records for coronavirus cases. And corporate Disney's not open though. Like Universal is open as well. And there's just this bigger concern with revenue and tourism, which is it's insane to me because I'm just thinking about this pandemic and this time. It's like Disney World is just not on my mind personally, and I wouldn't want to go to Disney World to get coronavirus, but I guess that's not a priority for everyone.
Do you think that has to do with maybe the lack of government mandated support? And even in the examples that you mentioned with financial assistance, you said small banks, or individual, individuals. I didn't hear you say anything about the local government supporting or advocating for financial assistance for those that are at risk of eviction. And the example that you gave, or in the context of Disneyland, it seems like that type of corporate behavior is also permissible in a landscape where there is no government mandated support. I mean, is that the right way to think about it? Until we see some local government action, we're going to be seeing this type of behavior really on all fronts?
Yeah, I really hope not. I mean, there's been some CARES Act funds that came from the federal government that local government has deployed for like personal protective equipment and for housing assistance. But the problem is a lot of those funds have dried up quickly. I have to look and send you numbers on how much exactly was allocated for housing assistance, which is essentially landlord assistance, which we were asking for. And that in itself was a struggle. One thing I worked on was trying to pass like rent freeze with like Commissioner Emily Bonilla, who's like our Orange County vice mayor. And the mayor of Orange County said no to supporting it to be placed on the ballot in November for people to decide if they want their rent to be frozen, because he's concerned about folks who have like their third, fourth, or like fifth home not being able to make money on that. And that was weird to me. I wish there was more concern and regard and like urgency for people immediately in their lives, but we're not seeing that in the budget. And I think they state their content with the things that they have done and the funds that they have deployed for this crisis.
Vanessa, why do you think there's this lack of urgency? What's missing in terms of having that push? Because when I'm seeing all of this as well, and as someone who's trying to educate myself more and more on these topics, I'm also left in awe as to why there's this kind of lack of push from kind of the stakeholders in and of themselves, right? So what do you think is that lack of urgency, or is it lack of incentive?
I think one is that people are just removed. Like, I don't think that Mayor Buddy Dyer, I don't even know if he knows what it's like to struggle. I'm not sure. Maybe he does, but if he does, he doesn't remember. Mayor Jerry Demings, the Orange County mayor, I don't know. I think, again, I also think he too is too far removed and not thinking about it. Orlando has the highest concentration of low wage service workers in the country because of the tourism industry. And those folks are struggling. Most of them are unemployed right now, cannot get unemployment assistance. And even if you do get that, it's not enough to support your family on. And so I think there's just like a real, like a distance and a lack of understanding in what it means to struggle your way through to provide for your family. And then two, it's just, I think they feel more of an incentive to support business and the economy. And those things are good for the state. I think that those are things that I think leaders, our state leaders and our county leaders and our city leaders should worry about. But I don't understand when it's people over profits at all cost. That to me is immoral. That to me is just cruel. And I think the lack of urgency is also, I think, folks are get busy with their lives and trying to make money and to do well and support their families. And so I think sometimes they don't hear from everyday people all the time, and a lot of their meetings are during the day, and that's inaccessible as well. So I think that's one of the good things about protests is they do push people to a place and they provide that urgency and that people power. And I think that is really important to keep up and to pressure those leaders who can make a difference.
Thank you so much for this, Vanessa. And just to end on a note that is fruitful to the audience, I want to ask you kind of more broadly, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, but so that our audience isn't removed, how do we think about being politically active, invested in these key issues for our audience going forward? And then, if certain measures are not taken, be it when it comes to affordable housing or when it comes to decriminalization, defunding of the police, if we could get your best and worst case outlook going into 2021.
For Florida, for the country,
For the
or
country, nationwide.
best. Okay, I'll start with the worst. The worst case scenario. I'm really scared that because of the virus, a lot of polling places have been shut down, and we've seen this happen in Kentucky. And there have been massive lines, and that people won't have access to ballots and or the polling sites. And then also, as folks, if you're evicted, you don't have an address. So voting by mail isn't something that you can do either. And that's a scary thought, just because our voting system is very tied to your address and where you live. And then, so I think worst case scenario is people get evicted throughout the country, and we have a crazier second wave coronavirus, because Florida's had, like, this is just the tail end of the first wave that we never really addressed. And then Donald Trump wins the national election, and I think a lot of things are swept under the rug, and things get worse, because especially in Florida, because our governor takes his marching orders directly from Donald Trump. And that's a scary thought to me. And I think we just keep seeing like workers' rights diminish and like people's rights diminish, and this exacerbation of these tensions between like white supremacists and this like solidification of this, it's okay to be openly racist. And then I think the best case scenario is people are able to vote. They mass organize and mobilize the polls. And then we have like a new president, but we still have to like push and like urge and like work with him for a better society. And I think the outcome with the police is that a lot of places just like rethink how we do policing and mass incarceration. And we look at how we can be restorative with it and like actually help rehabilitate people.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you so much for being my first guest.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for all of your insights. This was an immensely, very educating session for myself, and I'm sure for our audience. I know you'll share with me certain material, and I will share that with our audience. And then, I guess, to the audience and to the viewers, if you have follow-up questions, I would love to do a follow-up, a Q&A, maybe a live Q&A with Vanessa going forward. So I will be collecting those questions as we grow our following base. Thank you so much, Vanessa. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Jalen.